Heracles stepped into the dense woods of Nemea, where the sun barely reached through the twisted branches. The land was silent. Too silent. Villagers had long since abandoned the area, terrified of the monstrous lion that stalked the hills. This was no ordinary beast. Its golden fur was said to be impenetrable by sword, spear, or arrow. Blood-stained bones littered its hunting grounds, and no warrior had returned alive after challenging it. Heracles, wearing only a simple tunic and armed with a heavy club and bow, searched the forest. He tracked the lion's prints through mud and claw marks along trees, until at last he saw it. Massive, with burning eyes and a mane like a thundercloud. He loosed an arrow, but it bounced harmlessly off the lion's hide. Another struck its face and shattered. Realizing weapons were useless, Heracles dropped his bow and charged. The lion roared and lunged, but Heracles dodged and slammed his club into its skull with tremendous force. The club splintered on impact. Now unarmed, Heracles fought bare-handed. In a desperate struggle, he grappled the beast, wrapped his arms around its neck, and squeezed with the full force of a demigod. The lion thrashed, claws tearing into Heracles' skin, but he held tight until at last the creature collapsed. Breathing heavily, Heracles skinned the lion using one of its own claws, the only thing sharp enough to cut through its hide. He draped the impenetrable pelt over his shoulders, the lion's head forming a fearsome helmet. From that day on, it became his signature armor. Victorious, Heracles returned to King Eurystheus, but the cowardly king was so terrified by the sight of the lion skin that he refused to let Heracles enter the city. Instead, he ordered that future labors be reported from outside the gates, and he began hiding in a large bronze jar whenever Heracles approached. After slaying the Nemean Lion, Heracles was sent to a far more dangerous task, the destruction of the Lernaean Hydra. This creature, born of the monstrous Echidna and Typhon, lurked in a festering swamp near the lake of Lerna. It had 9 serpent heads, though some say even more, and when one was cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. To make matters worse, its breath was poisonous, and its blood so venomous that even its scent could kill. Heracles approached the marsh cautiously, his massive club in hand and his bow slung across his back. The air was thick with decay, and every step sunk deep into wet earth. With him came his loyal nephew, Iolaus, to serve as his charioteer and aide. As Heracles neared the Hydra's cave, he covered his mouth and nose, for the fumes were already starting to sting. He called out, challenging the beast, and the Hydra slithered forth, heads hissing and snapping. The ground quaked under its bulk. Heracles attacked without hesitation, striking one head off with his sword, but 2 immediately sprouted from the bloody stump. Again and again he swung, but the more he cut, the worse the monster became. Realizing brute force wouldn't win the day, Heracles called to Iolaus. Inspired by the gods, Iolaus grabbed a torch and began cauterizing each neck as soon as Heracles severed a head. With each flaming touch, the wound was sealed, and no heads returned. Working together, they fought deep into the night, until only the immortal central head remained. Heracles lifted his sword high and brought it down with divine fury, severing the final head. He buried it under a massive rock, ensuring it could never rise again. As a final stroke of cunning, Heracles dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, making them deadly to any creature, mortal or divine. He returned victorious once more, but Eurystheus refused to count the labor, claiming that Heracles had received help from Iolaus. Still, the Hydra was no more, and its toxic legend became part of the hero's growing myth. Heracles' next labor was not one of brute strength, but of patience, endurance, and care. He was tasked with capturing the Ceranian hind, an extraordinary golden deer sacred to the goddess Artemis. The hind was said to be faster than an arrow in flight, with golden antlers and hooves of bronze. It roamed the highlands of Arcadia, untouched by man, and anyone who harmed it would earn the wrath of Artemis herself. Heracles set out alone into the wilderness, tracking the creature by the faintest signs: a broken twig, a hoofprint near a stream, the shimmer of gold seen at a distance. Days turned to weeks. Seasons shifted. He followed it across valleys, over mountains, through thick pine forests, and even into distant northern lands where snow dusted the trees. He never raised his weapon. He did not try to harm it. He watched, learned, waited. Finally, one morning near the banks of the river Ladon, he found the hind drinking from a pool. Moving slowly, breath held, Heracles crept forward. With divine calm, he loosed a net and cast it gently over the animal. It struggled briefly, but he soothed it with whispered words. The hind was captured, unharmed. As Heracles began to lead the hind back to King Eurystheus, he was stopped by Artemis herself, appearing in radiant anger beside her twin, Apollo. She demanded to know why her sacred creature had been taken. Heracles bowed deeply and explained. He meant no disrespect or harm. He was only obeying the oracle's command, fulfilling a labor to purify his soul. Artemis, moved by his honesty and restraint, allowed him to take the hind on the condition that it would be returned safely. Heracles agreed. He brought the hind to Eurystheus, but as the king reached to claim it, Heracles let go, and the hind darted away into the forest, free once more. The king was furious, but Heracles had obeyed the task without breaking divine law. This labor, though quiet, showed that Heracles was more than muscle. He was capable of restraint, reverence, and wisdom, even in the face of divine power. Heracles was now sent to capture the Erymanthian boar, a monstrous beast that roamed the highlands of Arcadia. The boar was no ordinary animal. It was enormous, savage, and terrifying, with tusks like daggers and a roar that echoed through valleys. It trampled crops, gored hunters, and left a trail of destruction in its wake. Heracles was ordered to bring it back alive. As he journeyed to the mountain, Heracles stopped by the cave of the centaur Pholus, a wise and kind creature who welcomed him. They dined together, and Heracles asked to sample the sacred wine of the centaurs. When the jar was opened, its scent drifted far through the forest, reaching the noses of other centaurs who rushed in a frenzy, thinking their treasure was being stolen. A chaotic battle broke out. Heracles defended himself fiercely, accidentally killing several centaurs, including the noble Chiron, his former teacher, who was struck by a poisoned arrow and suffered terribly. Saddened by the unintended death, Heracles mourned but pressed on with his task. He climbed the icy slopes of Mount Erymanthos, where the snow was thick and the wind bitter. Tracking the boar's deep hoofprints, he finally spotted it crashing through the trees, snorting and charging through the snowdrifts. Heracles shouted, pounding the earth with his club, provoking the beast. The boar charged, but Heracles sidestepped and drove it upward into deeper snow. The boar struggled in the high drifts, slowed by the cold and weight of its own massive body. Heracles pounced, grabbed it by the tusks, and wrestled it into submission. He tied it securely with thick rope and hauled it down the mountain, dragging it back to Tiryns. When Heracles arrived, the beast squealing and thrashing at his side, King Eurystheus was so frightened that he dove into a large bronze jar he kept half buried in the ground. He peeked out only long enough to mumble approval of the labor. Heracles laughed, amused at the king's cowardice, then released the boar into the wilds where it could do no more harm. This labor, full of chaos, cold, and cunning, reminded the world that even the wildest forces of nature could be tamed by a hero with strength and strategy. For his next labor, Heracles was given a task that seemed beneath his strength. He was to clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day. But these were no ordinary stables. They housed thousands of cattle, and for over 30 years they had never been cleaned. The filth piled high, the stench unbearable, and disease spread across the surrounding lands. King Augeas, son of the sun god Helios, was known for his wealth and pride, and he scoffed at Heracles when he arrived. Heracles offered a bargain. If he cleaned the stables in one day, Augeas would give him 1/10 of his cattle. Thinking the task impossible, the king agreed and called witnesses to see the deal made. Heracles surveyed the disgusting mire of the stables, not with revulsion, but with curiosity. He didn't reach for a shovel or a broom. Instead, he studied the land. 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed nearby. With tremendous effort, he smashed through the stable walls, dug wide trenches, and diverted both rivers straight through the muck. The rushing waters flooded the stalls, washing away years of waste in a single thunderous surge. By sunset, the stables stood clean, gleaming, fresh, and aired out by the wind. The cattle stood calmly, the ground beneath them finally free of decay. But when Augeas saw what Heracles had done, he grew furious. Claiming Heracles had used trickery and divine help, he refused to pay the promised reward and banished him from Elis. Heracles left without complaint, knowing that justice would come in time. When he reported back, Eurystheus refused to count the labor, saying Heracles had tried to profit from it. Yet Heracles' ingenuity had turned the impossible into a miracle. In time, he would return to Elis and make Augeas answer for his dishonor. But for now, he moved forward, his reputation growing not only as a warrior, but as a thinker who could bend the power of nature to his will. Heracles was next sent to the cursed lake of Stymphalus in Arcadia, where a flock of monstrous birds had taken refuge. These were no ordinary birds. They were creatures of Ares, the god of war. With bronze beaks, razor-sharp metallic feathers, and glowing eyes, they feasted on human flesh and tore through crops and livestock. Their numbers were overwhelming, and their screeches could paralyze a man with fear. As Heracles approached the lake, he saw that the marshland was impenetrable. The birds had nested in the thick reeds, hidden and safe from attack. Whenever disturbed, they would swarm into the air in a deadly cloud, impossible to fight with sword or club. Heracles stood at the edge of the swamp, thinking. Then he remembered the gifts of the gods. From Athena, he had been given a pair of crotala, large bronze clappers forged by Hephaestus himself. Heracles climbed a nearby hill and began to strike the clappers together with thunderous rhythm. The sound echoed across the lake like a storm breaking open the sky. Startled and enraged, the birds burst into the air in a frenzied swarm. This was the moment Heracles had waited for. He lifted his bow, dipped in the poisonous blood of the Hydra, and fired. His arrows found their marks, striking the birds mid-flight. Some fell dead into the waters, others fled in terror, never to return. The sky cleared, and silence fell again over the swamp. Heracles descended to the lake's edge, where only feathers and bodies remained. The people of the nearby villages came out in awe and relief. Their farmlands, once plagued by the deadly birds, were safe once more. When Heracles returned to Eurystheus with news of the deed, the king was forced to acknowledge the labor. though he did so from within his bronze jar, peeking out only long enough to give a trembling nod. Heracles, unmoved, turned to face the next challenge, his legend now whispered among gods and mortals alike. Heracles journeyed across the Aegean Sea to the island of Crete for his next labor, to capture the mighty Cretan bull. This beast, once sent by Poseidon, was a divine creature meant for sacrifice, but King Minos, proud and cunning, had refused to honor the god's will. In anger, Poseidon drove the bull mad, and it rampaged across the island, destroying crops, homes, and terrifying the people. When Heracles arrived, he found Crete in turmoil. The bull had become a legend of destruction, its breath like fire, its hooves splitting the earth, and its strength unmatched. It roamed the fields, untamed and angry, its white coat shining like silver under the sun. King Minos, confident the beast could never be caught, welcomed Heracles with a smile and allowed him to try. Heracles did not argue or boast. He walked the open plains, scanning the hills until he spotted the bull near a distant grove. The beast saw him too and charged. Heracles stood his ground until the last moment, then leapt aside and grabbed the bull by its horns. The two clashed in a furious battle, man against god-born beast. Dust rose around them as Heracles dug in his heels, wrestled the bull to the ground, and finally subdued it with sheer force. He bound it with rope and led it, still snorting and thrashing, back to the shore. With a ship provided by Minos, Heracles brought the Cretan bull across the sea to King Eurystheus. The king, once again terrified by the living creature Heracles had captured, ordered it released. The bull broke free and wandered into the plains of Marathon, where its legend would continue until another hero, Theseus, would one day face it. Though the labor was complete, Heracles showed no pride. He simply turned to the next task, leaving behind the crashing waves and wind-swept cliffs of Crete, while stories of the bull and the man who tamed it echoed through the isles. Heracles was sent far to the north, to the savage land of Thrace, where King Diomedes ruled with iron and blood. Diomedes, son of Ares, owned 4 unnatural mares, giant fire-eyed horses that fed on human flesh. He kept them chained in iron, their mouths foaming and their eyes wild, feeding them the bodies of travelers and prisoners. The stables echoed with screams, and the land nearby lay empty, abandoned by all but the wicked. Arriving in the dead of night, Heracles crept into the darkened stables. The mares sensed him and reared up, shrieking and straining against their chains. Heracles knew he couldn't tame them through force alone, so he did what he had to. He waited for Diomedes to arrive with his guards. When the tyrant came, sneering and confident, Heracles met him in open battle. With club and fists, he struck down the guards, and after a brutal struggle, overpowered Diomedes himself. Then, in a grim twist of poetic justice, he fed the king to his own mares. The flesh of their master sated their unnatural hunger, and with their madness calmed, the mares became docile. Heracles led the beasts away, through rugged terrain and across rivers, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. When he returned to Eurystheus with the mares in tow, the king was stunned. Unwilling to keep such monsters, he released them into the wild, where they eventually wandered to Mount Olympus and were said to be devoured by wild beasts, or perhaps taken by the gods. The labor was grim and bloody, a reminder that not every monster had scales or claws. Sometimes the most monstrous were men, and sometimes justice came at the edge of a club. For his 9th labor, Heracles was commanded to retrieve the magical girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. This belt, given to her by Ares, symbolized her power and authority, and was said to grant unmatched strength and leadership in battle. Eurystheus wanted the girdle as a gift for his daughter, and so Heracles set sail with a band of warriors, venturing into the mysterious lands of the Amazonian queens. The Amazons were no ordinary tribe. They were skilled fighters, tall and fearless, trained from childhood to wield weapons with precision. Yet when Heracles arrived, Hippolyta greeted him peacefully. She admired his courage, and moved by his honest mission, agreed to give him the girdle willingly. But peace was not what the gods intended. Hera, always seeking to ruin Heracles, disguised herself as an Amazon and spread rumors that the hero had come to kidnap their queen. The Amazons, stirred by fear and fury, donned their armor and charged toward the shore where Heracles waited. When Heracles saw the army riding in, weapons raised, he believed he had been tricked. Thinking it was an ambush, he fought back. A great battle broke out. The clash of metal rang across the coastline, and Amazon warriors fell under Heracles' strength. In the chaos, Hippolyta tried to explain, but it was too late. Confused and heartbroken by the sudden war, she was either slain in battle or gave up her girdle before retreating, depending on the telling. Heracles took the belt and departed with a heavy heart, knowing that what began as a peaceful task ended in bloodshed. He returned to Eurystheus and delivered the girdle, but the cost weighed on him more than any victory. The labor was complete, but the lesson was bitter. Even goodwill can be destroyed by lies and the meddling hands of the gods. Heracles was sent on a long and perilous journey to capture the cattle of Geryon, a monstrous giant who lived on the far western shores. Geryon was unlike any foe Heracles had faced before. He had 3 bodies joined at the waist, each with its own head and set of arms. His cattle were extraordinary too, red, enormous, and guarded fiercely. The journey there was an epic in itself. Heracles crossed vast deserts, scorching sun beating down, and sailed across the restless ocean. On his way, he encountered the terrifying monster Orthrus, a 2-headed dog guarding the cattle, as well as the fierce herdsman Eurytion. Heracles fought and defeated them both with his immense strength. Finally, standing before Geryon himself, Heracles engaged in a brutal battle. The giant attacked with multiple blows from his 3 bodies, but Heracles dodged and struck back with unmatched fury. After a fierce struggle, the giant fell dead, and Heracles claimed the cattle. Herding the massive beasts was no simple task. The cattle, wild and frightened, stampeded through the rugged terrain as Heracles drove them across the sea and through hostile lands back toward Eurystheus. The journey was long and exhausting, but his determination never wavered. When he finally arrived, the king was once more overwhelmed by the sheer size and power of the prize. Yet, as always, Eurystheus accepted the cattle and counted the labor complete, though he remained wary of Heracles' growing legend. This labor showed Heracles' strength, endurance, and courage, not only in battle but in the relentless journey across dangerous lands and seas to achieve the impossible. Heracles' 11th labor was to retrieve the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, a place few mortals had ever seen. These apples were gifts from Gaia to Hera on her wedding day, and they granted immortality. The garden was hidden beyond vast deserts, towering mountains, and treacherous seas. It was guarded not only by the Hesperides, nymphs who tended the trees, but also by a fierce dragon named Ladon, whose 100 heads watched over the precious fruit. Heracles traveled far, seeking the location of the garden. He first sought the help of the sea god Nereus, who could change shape and knew many secrets. After a struggle, Heracles forced Nereus to reveal the path. He then met the Titan Atlas, who held the sky on his shoulders. Heracles asked Atlas to retrieve the apples for him, offering to hold up the heavens in his place for a time. Atlas agreed, and while he fetched the apples, Heracles stood patiently, bearing the weight of the sky. But when Atlas returned, he tried to trick Heracles into holding the sky forever. Cleverly, Heracles feigned agreement, but asked Atlas to take back the burden for just a moment so he could adjust his cloak. As soon as Atlas took the heavens, Heracles grabbed the apples and departed swiftly. Before leaving, Heracles decided not to keep the apples himself. He gave them to Athena, who returned them safely to the garden, respecting their sacred nature. This labor was a test of wit and endurance rather than brute strength. It showed Heracles' cleverness, diplomacy, and respect for the divine order, proving that even the strongest hero must sometimes rely on cunning to succeed. Heracles' final labor was the most daunting and terrifying: to capture Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed dog who guarded the gates of the Underworld. This fearsome beast prevented the dead from leaving and the living from entering. To succeed, Heracles would have to journey into the realm of the dead itself and face dangers unlike any before. With the permission of Hades and Persephone, Heracles descended into the gloomy depths. The air grew cold and heavy, and shadows moved like living things. He found Cerberus at the gates, its three snarling heads barking fiercely, its tail whipping like a serpent. Heracles did not draw his weapons. Instead, he reached out with powerful arms and wrestled the beast, using his immense strength to hold it without causing harm. The struggle was fierce, but Heracles' determination was greater. Finally, Cerberus submitted, and Heracles bound the creature and led it up from the underworld. The journey back to the surface was grim. Spirits of the dead whispered and watched, but Heracles stayed focused. When he emerged into the light, the living world seemed brighter and freer. He took Cerberus to King Eurystheus, who was horrified by the sight of the monstrous dog. The king begged Heracles to take the beast away quickly. Heracles returned Cerberus to Hades, completing his final labor. This last task showed that Heracles was not only strong and brave, but fearless of death itself. He had faced the ultimate darkness and emerged victorious, proving his place as the greatest hero of Greek myth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.